Angela Flores was arrested on Mother's Day after confessing to killing her 3 youngest children with the help of her teenage son. Authorities took Angela to the hospital around midnight on Saturday night after she was spotted in her neighbor's yard lighting candles and holding a Bible. She was also reportedly heard screaming, quote, "My family is abusing me," end quote. At around 7:40 the next morning, LAPD went to her West Hills home after a 911 call reporting an assault with a deadly weapon. They then found Angela's 12-year-old daughter and her 10 and 8-year-old sons deceased. How and when the children died have not yet been confirmed. Angela was arrested on 3 counts of murder along with her 16-year-old son, who she claimed also helped her kill the 3 children. Angela reportedly claimed to believe that the children were possessed by demons. About a week prior to the murders, Angela called her ex-husband and made odd comments, talking about God and death. He claimed that she was never really religious before and didn't know what to think about the phone call at the time. Angela is currently being held on a $6 million bail.
So you may have seen the TikTok that I made exposing this pedophile Gary Glitter for his crimes that he committed, but I have some really unfortunate news. After just serving half of his sentence, he was just released from prison in the UK. That means that this man, who was found with thousands of images of CP and was convicted of assaulting 2 young girls in a foreign country, is now free. Gary Glitter is a notorious musician. If you don't know, he wrote the song Rock and Roll, which is played at football games and other sporting events, and was featured in the movie The Joker in 2019. But his life has been mired with controversy. This guy has assaulted multiple kids, and he was found, like I said before, with CP materials on his computer. But thankfully, people in the UK are putting up a fuss about him being released from prison. There were actually some riots and protests outside of the hostel that he was released to. But even the family that lives next door to the hostel has gone to the news and said they're concerned because they're now living next to Gary Glitter, and they know what he did. So what do you think? Did he serve his time? Is he a reformed man, or should he still be incarcerated? Let me know below.
This mass shooter warned her friend minutes before she opened fire. Nashville school shooter Audrey Hale was friends with Avariana Patton, a former basketball teammate. She sent a chilling message to her friend warning her that she was going to take her life and that something bad was going to happen. Obviously extremely panicked by this, her friend decided to call the suicide prevention hotline, but they told her to call police. Frustratingly, when she then did make that call to police, they told her to ring the non-emergency number. However, by this time it was too late. Audrey had entered the school and opened fire on innocent teachers and children. Police found her on the 2nd floor of the school and she was pronounced dead at 10:27 a.m. Police believe that she entered through a side door and she was able to enter the school with 2 rifles and a handgun. Victims included Catherine Kuntz, the head of the school, Mike Hill, another employee, Cynthia Peake, a teacher, and 3 9-year-olds, Hallie Scruggs, William Kinney, and Evelyn Dykehouse. Despite Audrey receiving help for an emotional disorder, she was still allowed to purchase 7 weapons legally.
Missing Idaho teen allegedly stabbed woman to death in Las Vegas and then hid her body in a dumpster. This kid's name is Lincoln Bowe. Let's talk about what happened. On April 29th at 7 a.m., police responded to a call about a woman in a dumpster. Now, upon investigating, they positively identified the victim and they found out she had stab wounds all over her. She was about 60 years old and died 2 days before they found the body. Now, after being interviewed by the police, Lincoln Bowe said he wanted to get out of Idaho, go to Las Vegas, and have some fun and have some freedom. Now, here's where things get super weird. Bowe was seen parking his car by a business. He went inside the business and started asking about where the cameras were. I'm not even sure why, but they showed him where the cameras were, and they said there were none in the back by the dumpster. He did a little dance of happiness. He's then seen rummaging through the dumpster. It's pretty obvious to investigators he was trying to hide the crime about killing the woman. Police arrested Bowe on May 2nd, took him to county jail. He's being held there without bail, and he's being charged with murder with a deadly weapon. I'm not even sure why they would show him where the cameras were as some random dude walking in. I'm also not sure why he would start dancing. Like, you turned yourself in at that point. Let me know what you guys think about this story in the comment section below, and as always, these videos are for informational purposes only.
A search for 2 missing girls has uncovered a horrific tragedy. 7 bodies have been discovered on a property in Oklahoma the same day that the man living there had been scheduled to appear in court on child P charges. These were the 7 bodies found on the property. They were all found shot to death. 39-year-old S offender Jesse McFadden was renting the property. He was living with his wife Holly and 3 teenage children. He had apparently hidden his criminal convictions from his family until very recently and was apparently a very controlling man. He was convicted of R back in 2003 and was actually released from prison in 2020. Shockingly, reports have come out that whilst in prison he used a smuggled mobile phone to send indecent pictures of himself to a 16-year-old girl. His wife's daughter, Tiffany, had 2 school friends who were the missing girls. Ivy Webster and Brittany Brewer were found deceased at the home. They'd been having a sleepover at the property and an Amber Alert was issued when they didn't come home. When Jesse failed to turn up to court for the child P charges, police executed a search warrant at his home. This is when investigators found all 7 bodies, including Jesse. He had unalived himself at the scene.
The Little Albert experiment, and it consisted of a 9-month-old baby. And in 1920, John B. Watson's study started. He studied behaviorism, but he was specifically drawn to the reason why certain kids, or just humans in general, have fear to specific things. And he was basically trying to see if he could make somebody have a phobia on purpose, on things that they would intuitionally wouldn't be afraid of. This is where we come to Little Albert. So first, he showed a puppy to the baby, and he doesn't really care too much of it. He shows him a rabbit, shows him a monkey, also a mouse, and he has no reactions. But then whenever he introduced these animals again, whenever the baby would touch it,
What, he would make like a scary noise or something, or?
yeah, exactly. So there would be like a big ass metal pole, and with a hammer he would just boom every time the baby would touch it. Slowly but surely, like, the baby would have a reaction. He was like traumatizing the kid the whole time. Like, the baby would start crying. He was trying to see exactly how much time it took for him to fully become scared of whatever he was trying to make him scared of. He was purposely trying to train the baby's mind to be scared of whatever he wanted him to be scared of.
What the fuck? That's fucked.
Also, they never found out how little Albert was put into this experiment. They don't know if he was like the mother.
Cannibal facts that'll eat at you for days. 2001, a man named Armin Maiwis posted an ad on a website called Cannibal Cafe looking for someone to be killed and eaten. A German engineer named Bernd Brandes volunteered, and after photos and videos of the incident were posted online, Armin was sent to jail, where today, he's a vegetarian.
You guys are all familiar with the Paris catacombs, right? Like the history behind it and stuff like that.
The cemetery.
The cemeteries were being overflowed with fucking bodies, and then they didn't know where to put them, so they decided to make the catacombs, which is another fucking city under Paris, and it like runs for fucking miles, bro. What I wanted to get at was there was some explorers who went down there, I think in the early 2000s, like deep ass part of the fucking catacombs that has not been explored yet, but they found a camera. They took it to the authorities took a look at it, and then what they saw on the camera was a guy, he's exploring the catacombs, like he looks like he knows what he's doing, and then eventually he just starts following these arrows on the walls and on the floor. And then out of nowhere he just starts getting frantic, and he starts running, and then he drops the camera.
After about 40 minutes of these point of view shots and these pictures of bones, we hear his breathing get louder and louder, and all of a sudden he drops the camera. The camera just drops on the ground and keeps rolling. And it keeps rolling until it runs out of tape.
Was he alone? Did he see something, or was he just like afraid that he couldn't find his way back?
I think that's scary, because if the guy was really trying to find a way out, you'd start to panic, bro, because you don't even know if you're going deeper or you're getting out. No matter if you're going one way, just 1 second it takes to really get distracted and be like, wait, which way was I coming from again?
People are saying that maybe the video was a hoax, maybe it was actually real. Like, that's a whole like argument.
Somebody just put that camera down there to...
Yeah, because like...
These are some of Christina Grimmie's final moments. She rose to fame after she started posting videos on YouTube of her covering popular singles. She soon hit 1 million subscribers and then 2 million, after which she released her debut album With Love in 2013. She was a really talented singer, and she was also a contestant on The Voice, in which one of the judges actually offered to sign her to his label. On June 10th, 2016, Christina performed at the Plaza Live in Orlando, Florida. What she didn't know was that someone in the crowd had become completely obsessed with her, and he was watching her every move. James Loibel had travelled from his home in St. Petersburg with 2 handguns, 2 magazines full of ammunition, and a large hunting knife. There were actually no metal detectors at the venue that night, so he managed to get past security no problem with his weapons. After she'd performed, Christina was signing autographs when she was approached by James. She opened her arms to hug him, thinking that he was like any other fan. but when he got close, he pulled out a handgun and shot her 3 times at point-blank range. James was tackled by Christina's brother, but he managed to break free, back up against a wall, and take his own life. Christina was rushed to hospital with a faint pulse, but tragically she couldn't be saved. She'd been shot once in the head and twice in the chest. She was buried at a private ceremony at Berlin Cemetery on June 16, 2016.
Moments after that video was recorded, this man pushed his pregnant wife off of that cliff, killing her. The man's name is Hakan Aysal. He was 41 years old when this happened, and his wife's name was Semra. Now, eerily enough, when you look up this couple's name on Google, tons of photos pop up of them hanging out on or near cliffs. It's eerie to me to see Semra sitting here on a cliff's edge, knowing that later on in life she would be pushed off something similar to this to her death. So Hakan had lured his wife out to the cliff, even though she was afraid of heights, on the pretense of taking a selfie. A selfie sort of like these. But when he got her out on the cliff, he pushed her off. She then fell 304 feet to her death. Now, before this event, Hakan had taken out a $25,000 life insurance policy on his pregnant wife. And on that day, apparently he was trying to strike it rich. It's disturbing to me that his wife and unborn child's life were worth $25,000 to him. According to eyewitnesses who saw this go down, they were joking amongst themselves, saying, "What are they doing out there near those cliffs?" And one of these witnesses even cracked a joke and said either she's gonna push him or he's gonna push her. And then, to this witness's horror, that's exactly what they saw happen. So Hakan cashed in this life insurance policy immediately, which was a red flag, and eventually, with video evidence that came forward and witnesses, he was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 30 years served. If you want to hear more true crime stories, listen to the podcast Murder in America that I co-host with my wife Courtney. It's available on all streaming platforms.
The man who attempted to murder a teenager and left her for dead in the woods has been released. It's a miracle that Ashley Reeves survived an attempted murder, but now her attacker is walking free. It was the 29th of April 2006 in Belleville, Illinois. At around 2 a.m, officers found 17-year-old Ashley Reeves just moments from death. She'd been left in the woods to die for over 30 hours. Paramedics rushed her to hospital and placed her in an induced coma. She was actually in such a bad way that they'd initially thought she was dead. 2 days prior to this, Ashley told her parents that she had an interview to attend. She was in a relationship with a boy called Jeremy Smith at the time, and she took his car to drive herself to the interview. When she didn't come home, her parents were extremely worried. They called authorities and began the hunt. Officers later discovered her boyfriend's abandoned car, and inside were a change of clothes that Ashley had taken to change into after her interview. That's when they discovered Ashley nearby. She'd been strangled with a belt and had her neck broken, but miraculously she was still alive. Police discovered a man named Samson Shelton was the last person to contact her. He was her teacher and a professional wrestler. They arrested him on suspicion of attempted murder. He changed his story multiple times before eventually admitting to strangling the poor girl. He said he broke her neck with his arm. He said the pair had gotten into an argument over a relationship they were having. He said they had sex, and then after the vicious attack, he had thrown her into the woods. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but has recently just been released on parole after serving just 17 years. It truly is a miracle that Ashley managed to survive this attack, and her story was made into a movie named Left for Dead: The Ashley Reeves Story.
This guy secretly has a camera and he's recording women on the subway. A TikTok user uploaded this video about this creepy dude with this bag, and if you zoom in, you see the camera. I did it for you. As you can see, the iPhone phone is flipped upside down. It's taped up nice. It's like very, very like inconspicuous. Let me play the full video for you guys because it's weird. You can see him kind of turning the bag to try to hide it, you know, moving it around. Seriously though, this is some next level creepy shit. You have to be so creepy and devious to come up with this idea of like cutting a tiny hole in the bag to fit the iPhone camera through. And the bag is pretty taped up. I'm sure that's not the only attempt he's made. He probably had to get the height, the angle, everything just right. I mean, if you're on the subway and you see the guy in the video, just stay away from him, I guess. I still cannot believe the stuff I see on TikTok like this. This is just wild. The bear argument continues to get more valid because of weird shit like this. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comment section below. I've also tagged the creator who uploaded the original video. Go check out her page. And as always, these videos are for informational purposes only.
This YouTuber vlogged his plans to murder and decided the fate of people's lives on the toss of a coin. Randy Stair was a 24-year-old who enjoyed vlogging on YouTube. He actually named himself Andrew Blaze and kept videos and recordings expressing that he wanted to unalive himself. He provided plans of how he would carry out a shooting and beliefs that in doing so he could cross over into a cartoon world. In April 2017, he posted the video Fate by Coin Flip. He explained that if heads won, he would unalive himself at home. If tails won, however, he would carry out a mass unaliving at his work. In a dramatic video that has obviously since been removed, tails won on the final coin flip. In June 2017, he was working a late-night shift at Wise Markets in Pennsylvania. During closing time at around 11 p.m., he went to the back of the store and blocked off an emergency exit. He then continued to stock shelves and clean up. An hour later, he sent links via his Twitter account detailing his murderous plans. He then went on to block off other exits of the store. He put on black eyeliner and black lipstick and went to his car and sent his mum a text message explaining how he would like to be disposed of. He pulled out 2 weapons and started his plan. He killed Victoria Brong, Brian Hayes and Terry Lee Sterling. He actually approached his co-worker Kristen Newell, who had headphones in, so she hadn't heard what had gone on. She reports that he stared at her for a few moments and then simply walked on and didn't shoot her. She actually managed to escape and called 911. While she was on the phone to police, Randy unalived himself. Many wanted the store to be closed permanently, but in July that year the store was reopened with a new interior and new layout. The community knew that Randy would have wanted the store to be shut down permanently and they didn't want him to win.
What are you doing?
This is a gun. Keep driving.
No, it's not. Stop. Come on, man. I got a family. What are you doing?
I got a family too. Now drive.
What are you doing?
Drive.
Please stop.
Drive the car, miss.
I have 4 kids. What are you doing?
What you just saw were some of the final moments of Uber driver Christy Spicuzza's life. This is an extremely sad and horrific story. Christy Spicuzza was a mother from Pennsylvania who worked for Uber. She had a loving family, and on the night of February 10th, 2022, she was expecting to just work her normal shift on Uber. But on that tragic night, Christy picked up this man, Calvin Crew. Now, Christy had a dash cam video camera which was facing her and her passengers. And for the first 20 minutes or so of this ride, Calvin just sat in the back seat not saying anything, and Christy even tried to ask him questions like, "Did you have a good day? How's it going?" But at one point, Calvin pulls out a pistol, places it against Christy's skull, and informs her that she needs to drive. Now, Christy would continue to drive, and she begged the man in the back seat for her life, talking about her amazing children and her family and how it doesn't have to go like this, but it seems like Calvin's mind was already decided. And just 2 days later, Christy's car and her dead body were found in a neighboring area. Calvin had forced Christy to drive out to an isolated wooded area and murdered her out in the woods. After the murder, Calvin had used Christy's cell phone to access some of her financial apps like Cash App and sent himself some money, but it wasn't even a very large sum of money that this man stole. Calvin's girlfriend, Tanaya Mullen, was actually the one who called the Uber for her boyfriend that night. And she had even texted him that evening and said, "I'm not going to jail if we get caught." Which is true because she never ended up going to jail or prison for her involvement in this horrifically sad crime. This is just such a tragic story that obviously did not need to happen, and that footage is some of the most horrifying that I've ever seen.
This girl went missing in 2019, only to be found alive 3 years later inside a staircase. Parents Kim Cooper and Kirk Schultes lost custody of Paisley and her older sister, and they were due to be handed over to a legal guardian in 2019 when Paisley mysteriously went missing while her sister was at school. Kim and Kirk had fled to Kirk's father's house, presumably with Paisley, but when police tracked them down and searched the house, Paisley was nowhere to be seen, and her parents said they had absolutely no idea what had happened to her. That house was searched multiple times in 2019, and Paisley remained missing, but in February 2022, police received an anonymous tip-off saying that Paisley was definitely in that house. They searched it again and still couldn't find Paisley, but this time they went down into the basement and there was a bedroom set up. The bed looked slept in and the name Paisley was written on the wall in childlike writing. An officer then noticed something strange about the staircase. There was a slight gap above one of the stairs, and when he shone his torch through, he could see a blanket. He decided to pull the staircase apart, and when he took out one piece of wood, he saw a little set of feet. It was Paisley. She was rescued from that staircase. Police had been in that house for 4 hours searching. They'd walked up and down that staircase multiple times, and Paisley had stayed completely silent. Kim and Kirk were arrested along with Kirk's father, but annoyingly I cannot find a single thing online about their trials or their charges. I did, however, find an article that stated in July 2023, Paisley and her older sister were returned to the care of their mother, Kim.
This UK true crime case is absolutely disgusting. On the 11th of December 2017, emergency services were called to a house fire. It was just before 5 a.m. in Walkden, England. Firefighters battled to contain the horrific fire that engulfed the property. Time really was of the essence as there was an entire family trapped inside. Many would have presumed at the time that this was just a tragic accident. However, the truth of what happened is absolutely sickening. Inside the home was 37-year-old mother Michelle Pearson. Her children were also trapped, 8-year-old Brandon, 15-year-old Demi, and 7-year-old Lacey, and 3-year-old Leah. Despite the fire service's best efforts, the eldest 3 children passed away in the fire. The 3-year-old was rushed to hospital but tragically died 2 days later. Mum Michelle was rushed to hospital and had to receive extensive medical treatment for her horrific injuries. She remained in a coma and had to be kept in hospital until March 2019. She tragically died on the 25th of August 2019. The horrifying deaths were a result of these 3 individuals: Zach Bolland, David Worrell, and Courtney Brierley. Terrifyingly, the trio had made homemade petrol devices in the kitchen of a nearby address. On the night in question, Courtney remained in the car while the 2 men smashed through the window of the victim's home. They then threw the devices inside the kitchen and the living room. Now, I have never heard of this happening before, but the fire spread so quickly and the heat was so intense that the smoke alarms melted before even having chance to alert the family. Zach and David were jailed for a combined total of 77 years. Courtney pleaded guilty to manslaughter and got just 12 years in jail.
The disturbing true story behind this photograph will haunt you. In this picture from a prison security camera, we see a man sitting at a table, an inmate, and another inmate right behind him wielding a metal pipe. The man at the table was Carl Williams, a notorious mob boss from Australia. On October 13, 1999, Carl Williams was shot in the stomach by another gang member, and this sparked a bloody war between mob families that eventually became known as the Melbourne Gangland Killings. Carl Williams, as it turned out, was a very powerful man. And over the next 10 years or so, he ordered hits on 5 different members of the opposing crime family. One of these hits was especially brutal. In that hit, a man named Jason Moran was targeted. And Jason was the guy who initially shot Carl in the stomach and started this whole thing off. On June 21, 2003, Jason Moran and a passenger were in a van with 5 children. At the time of the hit, the 5 kids were in the back of the van and the 2 passengers were in the front. And that's when a man that Carl had hired approached the van and fired a shotgun and a handgun through the windows up front. Both of the targets of this hit were brutally murdered in the attack, and the 5 children in the backseat witnessed all of this go down. But eventually all of Carl's dirty deeds caught up to him and he was sentenced to life in prison. And that's when Carl decided to start ratting. As it turns out, Carl wanted to reduce his prison sentence, so he began selling out all of his colleagues. And that's what leads us to this infamous photograph. On April 19, 2010, Carl was sitting at a table in the prison when a man named Matthew Charles Johnson approached him from behind. Matthew was carrying an exercise bike handle in his hands, and he proceeded to brutally beat Carl to death. Matthew was already in prison for murder, so in his mind he had nothing to lose. And this was just a simple act in his mind of gangland vengeance. There have been a lot of theories that have swirled around the internet, and some people believe that the prison officials were actually in on this hit, that they had been paid off and they allowed this whole thing to go down. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more true crime stories, listen to the podcast Murder in America that I co-host with my wife, Courtney. It's available on all streaming platforms.
This is the mass shooting that stunned Las Vegas. Stephen Paddock was a real estate investor, accountant, pilot, and poker player who lived in Nevada. His dad was actually a bank robber who was put in prison when Stephen was just 7 years old. His dad ended up escaping prison and becoming one of the FBI's most wanted. Stephen was divorced twice but was on good terms with both of his exes. He was actually living with his girlfriend at the time of his death. Now, during his last months, Stephen apparently smelled of alcohol frequently and also had prescriptions of anti-anxiety medication. Shockingly, in the space of 1 year, he purchased 55 firearms. 2 days prior to a horrific shooting that he orchestrated, he actually was seen on CCTV driving to do some target practice. No one knew that Stephen was planning such a hideous attack. On November the 25th, 6 days before the shooting, he checked into the Mandalay Bay Hotel with 10 shooting range bags and a computer. He checked into a room that overlooked the Las Vegas Strip, which is actually where the Route 91 Harvest Festival was going to take place. 4 days later, he checked into an extra suite which connected to the first. On October the 1st at 10:05 p.m, Stephen Paddock fired more than 1,000 rounds from his hotel room. The crowd below was showered with bullets and 60 people were killed. 867 people were also wounded. This is obviously not to mention the countless amount of people who were completely traumatized by witnessing the events. At some point during the attack, Stephen had put a baby monitor on the room service trolley outside of the room. He fired about 35 rounds through the door, wounding security guard Jesus Campos. Stephen had actually screwed one of the hotel doors shut to prevent the staff entering. After the horrific 11-minute-long attack, Stephen shot and unalived himself. Police discovered from CCTV footage that Stephen had brought a huge amount of weapons into his rooms in suitcases over the days that he was staying in the hotel. Another 19 firearms were found at his home. According to police, he acted alone and they have not been able to determine a motive.
May 13th, 1988 was just like any other day for 29-year-old Rebecca White until she was brutally killed for being herself. That day, Rebecca and her girlfriend, Claudia Brenner, were hiking and camping along the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania. They parked their car at Dead Woman Hollow and then hiked into the Michoud State Forest where they set up camp. The couple had been together for 2 years and they were really excited to spend some time together. Shortly after this, Rebecca ran into a man at a public restroom near their campsite named Stephen Roy Carr, who was a drifter. He asked if she had a cigarette. She told him no because she didn't, and then hurried back to Claudia. The man was giving her a really bad feeling, so the couple moved to a more private campsite. Stephen began stalking the couple, and when they ran into him again, they moved to a third location to get away from him. With things seeming to calm down, the two ate dinner and began to have sex. This is when Stephen, who was watching them from the bushes, opened fire. He shot at the women 8 times. Claudia was hit 5 times in her arm, face, head, and neck. Becca was shot twice in the head and back, which made her liver explode. Becca was unable to stand up, so Claudia managed to hike 4 miles to the road where she flagged a car down for help. She wanted to go back for Rebecca, but instead, the people who found her took her to a nearby fire station. When police arrived to the campsite, they found Rebecca, who died from her injuries, alone in the woods. Stephen left a ton of evidence behind at the scene, but over the next 10 days, he went into hiding at a Mennonite community. And since members of the Mennonite community don't read the news or watch TV, the family giving him shelter had no idea he was a murderer. Eventually, though, Stephen was arrested, and he initially told authorities that he was shooting at a deer and missed. That lie soon fell apart. At the trial, Stephen claimed that he had been enraged by the sight of the 2 women having sex and that they taunted him by having sex in front of him. His defense argued that Stephen had been sexually assaulted as a child and that, quote, the couple's lesbianism provoked his inexplicable rage, end quote. The judge was thankfully not having any of this and ultimately ruled all of that irrelevant. The judge also didn't allow anyone to know of the women's relationship, which forced Stephen to accept a sentence of life in prison without parole. Claudia has since become one of the most prominent activists against anti-gay violence. Claudia went on to say, quote, the man who killed someone I love and almost killed me had no other information about us other than the fact that we were lesbians. I almost died because I am a lesbian. The more people identify with Rebecca and me, the more they realize that it could be their sister or brother or daughter or friend. I think Rebecca would be really proud of me, end quote.
This cartel video I'm about to explain is extremely brutal and I don't recommend looking it up. The video that I'm about to explain went viral on Twitter and Reddit, and also in Mexico. So much so that the government of Guerrero threatened media outlets who were pushing and talking about the clip. And apparently people claim this brutal video I'm about to explain was done by the CJNG cartel, but it hasn't been confirmed yet which cartel was responsible. And as always, before I begin, this is a massive trigger warning. The video is not long at all and only lasts 40 seconds, and it's an aftermath video of truly a horrific dismemberment. As you play the video, you see the victim, who is a man who looks to be in his early 30s. He is shirtless and he has been completely demolished. But somehow he is still alive. Despite the awful and intense pain he's in and the massive loss of blood, he is still completely conscious and aware. The man is sitting on the ground and he is in pieces. The interrogator is talking, but the man has no energy to scream or talk. The man is making groaning sounds, and the look on his face looks like someone who is trying to stay alive. The man's arms have been completely removed at the shoulders, and his legs have technically been hacked off below the knees, and are only hanging on by a few strands of skin. Also, he has a huge machete cut on his back that appears to be inches deep. The man then rolls over to his side and groans and grimaces horribly. The person filming then asks who killed Juanito Castellanos, but the victim is unable to reply, and as the man rolls over in complete pain and agony, the cameraman says, "This is what's going to happen to all of you, one by one. I'm going to tear them apart." As you continue to play the video, you realize just how much the dirt floor is stained with blood. In the background, you can also see a bucket of water that was most likely used to prevent the victim from passing out during this awful ordeal. It's crazy how the victim is still alive at this point, and due to the amount of blood he already lost, he's not even bleeding anymore since there's barely any blood left. Seeing the victim roll around in pain and the life slowly leave his body is something you should never want to see. It's absolutely awful and flat out disturbing. But what's awful is what is left of this man doesn't even resemble a human. The videos that come out of Mexico of these cartels are just gut-turning, and this video can only be described as inhumane and disturbing. I only cover these videos to give you guys the reality of what happens in real life with these cartels and the brutality they carry out, and as always, I don't recommend searching or watching them. This video is very graphic, brutal, and just sad. And whatever you do, don't look it up.
This is Gary Glitter, one of the worst pedophiles in world history. And this guy was a rock star. The story is extremely disturbing. So all of the bad things that Gary Glitter had done in the past resurfaced in 2019 when The Joker came out. His song was the one that was used during this infamous dancing stairway scene. But let's rewind. Paul Francis Gadd was born in 1944 in England. It was in the year 1971 during the glam rock movement when Paul began to use the stage name Gary Glitter, and his career really took off. The release of his album titled Glitter was a massive success. The song Rock and Roll reached high points on all charts across the world, and he seemed to be this, new age progressive rock and roll star. And for years, Gary was heralded as a rock and roll icon. This guy was loved by thousands, millions of people across the planet. But that would all change in the year 1997 when Gary took his computer into a repair shop in England. The technician at the time that was taking a look at Gary's laptop discovered CP images on his hard drive. The police then got involved. They searched his home and found even more CP. This guy was sick. After all was said and done, it was discovered that Gary had downloaded over 4,000 images of CP onto his computer. He had also had a relationship with a 14-year-old girl in the 1970s, and he was given a 4-month prison sentence. After he was released from prison, Gary felt the heat from the public now hating him in England, so he fled to another country. But after the authorities in Cambodia discovered who he was exposed, and he was then deported to Bangkok. He eventually settled, though, in Vietnam. And it was in Vietnam where Gary resumed his typical pedo behaviors. He was banned from a nightclub for groping a teenage waitress. Other people saw him bringing 2 young girls into his home. And on November 12, 2005, Gary fled his home in Vietnam. Authorities eventually searched the place and found a 15-year-old girl that was living with him. He then tried to escape the country, but he was arrested at the airport. And from that point on, multiple Vietnamese girls came forward that were underage and said that Gary Glitter had, assaulted them in the past. After all was said and done, he was sentenced to about 3 years in prison in Vietnam. And if he would have been convicted on all the charges that he faced, he might have been executed by firing squad. Eventually, though, he served his sentence and he was released in Vietnam. And after a lot of countries said they wouldn't let Gary Glitter in, he returned home to the UK. But he wasn't safe there. He was arrested shortly after arriving back in the UK after he faced a number of new allegations against him. Eventually, he was charged with 8 counts of sexual offenses against girls from the ages of 12 to 14 in the years 1977 to 1980. One of these charges alleged that he even crept into a 10-year-old girl's bed and attempted to essay her. So after a lengthy trial, he was finally caught again. He was imprisoned, but he could be released next year in 2023. I know that the movie The Joker received a lot of backlash for using Gary Glitter's song because he was compensated with royalties, even after all of these things had happened to him. And yeah, this just shows that this guy was not and is not a good dude.
It was a beautiful day on March 26, 1986, when 12-year-old Michelle Welch and her 2 younger sisters went on a bike ride to Puget Park in Tacoma, Washington. When they arrived, the girls realized they'd forgotten their picnic lunch, so Michelle rode back home to get it. This would be the last time they ever saw their big sister alive. Once Michelle was gone, the 2 sisters realized they had to use the restroom, so they briefly left the park to try and find a nearby bathroom. Once they returned, they found Michelle's bike and their lunch, but no sign of Michelle herself. They used a family signal call, which was a loud yelp that echoed throughout the park to try and locate her, but Michelle never responded. Sadly, police later found her body near a makeshift fire pit hidden amongst the trees. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and her throat had been slit. Michelle's murder shocked the entire Tacoma community, and kids no longer felt safe riding their bikes alone. Authorities recovered a DNA sample from Michelle's body, but when it was eventually sent off for testing, it showed that it was not a match to anyone in the National CODIS database. During the investigation, though, a lot of tips came in, including one from Michelle's classmate who reported seeing a man in the park staring at the girls the day of the murder. She gave enough details for authorities to create a composite sketch. Another tip came in from a man named Robert Washburn. Remember his name, this is important. Robert said he was jogging in the nearby Point Defiance Park and had seen a man who fit the description of Michelle's killer. But this failed to provide any leads, and Michelle's case went cold for 3 decades. In 2018, the Tacoma Police Department began working with a forensic genealogy expert who was able to use new DNA methods to narrow Michelle's killer down to 2 brothers. One of those brothers was 66-year-old Gary Hartman, who was a nurse at a psychiatric facility. Authorities followed him closely and was able to get his DNA from a used napkin, where it was then sent to the lab for testing. The results came back with a match. Gary Hartman was responsible for the murder of Michelle Welch. At the time of the murder, Gary was 30 years old, lived about a mile away from the park, and had no prior criminal history. In 2022, Gary was convicted of first-degree murder, and at 70 years old was sentenced to 26 years in prison. But in a twisted turn of events, just 5 months after Michelle was murdered back in 1986, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian was also sexually assaulted and murdered in the nearby Point Defiance Park. At the time, investigators believed the 2 girls were murdered by the same person, but they initially couldn't find any DNA evidence left behind in Jennifer's case. So her case also went cold for 3 decades. But, like Michelle's case, in 2018, a cold case detective decided to test the clothing Jennifer was wearing at the time once again, and was actually able to pull some DNA from it. After also working with a forensic genealogy expert, this new DNA was sent in for testing, and it came back with a match. The now 70-year-old Robert Washburn. And if you remember, Robert was a jogger in Point Defiance Park who called in a tip on Michelle's case just 5 months before he murdered Jennifer himself. Investigators still don't know why he inserted himself in that investigation. In 2020, Robert was found guilty and sentenced to 27 years in prison. Because of new DNA technology, after 30 years, both Michelle and Jennifer now have justice.
Sometimes true for stranger than fiction. The case of Richard Trenton Chase is a story which even the most depraved horror writer would struggle to create. Over the course of 4 weeks spanning across 1977 and 1978, Richard Chase took the lives of 6 innocent victims in Sacramento, California. His murders gradually progressed in violence, beginning with drive-by shootings and culminated in acts of cannibalism.
This 87-year-old man was brutally murdered in broad daylight, and this case would not sit right with you. The case that I'm about to explain took place in London, and it's extremely disturbing. This was Thomas O'Halloran, an 87-year-old man that lived in an area called Greenford in London. He was described by people as very nice and loved by literally everybody. Thomas was also always outside his supermarket playing his accordion, raising money for charities. And on August 16th, 2022, Thomas was raising money for a charity outside his local supermarket, and when he was done, he made his way home. Thomas used a mobility scooter to get around due to his age and probably some other issues. So he made his way home on his scooter. Thomas lived with his daughter, so he called her and said he would be home soon. But it's theorized that somebody had noticed Thomas raising money and noticed he had a decent amount of money on him. And sadly, as Thomas was making his way home and was on his final stretch of road before he reached his home, it is assumed that this person tried to rob him, but it went horribly wrong. The person stabbed Thomas in the chest and neck and then fled the scene. After being attacked, Thomas rode his scooter down the road and tried to get some help. He was captured on CCTV talking to two young people. He pleaded for them to call emergency services, and Thomas managed to travel 75 yards on his mobility scooter shouting for help. Emergency services arrived at the scene and did everything they could, but sadly, Thomas passed away on the side of the road. Thomas's daughter continued to call him as she was very worried on where he could possibly be. She then got a knock on the door from the police telling her the tragic news about her father, Thomas. The police then started searching for who was responsible for this awful attack. Soon after, this CCTV still was released to the public in hopes somebody knew him or saw him. The police said if you see this man, don't approach him and just call the authorities. And as you can see in the image, he is holding a large knife and his gloves appear to be covered in blood. 2 days later, on August 18th, the suspect was caught and his name was Lee Byer. Lee was a 44-year-old man from London and he was charged with the murder of Thomas. What makes this case stand out is not only that Thomas was an 87-year-old elderly man, but someone who needed assistance in the form of a mobility scooter. Thomas was incapable of fighting back and was completely vulnerable. Lee Byer could have easily just taken the money and if not, could have easily just ran away. But instead, he brutally murdered him in broad daylight. This case shows the best of society, a retired man spending his free time raising money for various groups and people who need it, and the worst of society, a man who was willing to rob an elderly man and stick a knife into his neck for a small amount of money. Lee Byer is currently being held at Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital and is due to be sentenced on May 10th. This case is absolutely awful and this world is just full of sick people. May Thomas rest in peace.
This is one of those cases that doesn't sit right with me. This is Dorothy Jane Scott. She was murdered in the 1980s, and for years, the killer tormented her family with phantom phone calls. And to this day, they are still out there somewhere. So let's dive into the story. So the story of Dorothy's disappearance is really strange. On the night of May 28, 1980, Dorothy drove two of her friends to the hospital, as one of them had been bitten by a spider that night. So at the end of the hospital visit, while they were waiting to get a prescription filled, Dorothy Jane walked to go grab her car and bring it up so that the two friends could meet her outside. And once they were outside, the friends saw Dorothy's car coming towards them, but it quickly sped off and left them there. Now, they couldn't see who exactly was in the car, who was driving, because the headlights blinded them, but in a few hours, they reported her missing because they couldn't get in contact with Dorothy. And she would be missing for years. So in the months leading up to her murder, Dorothy had acquired a stalker. She had been receiving phone calls at work from a strange, unidentified male caller. And on these phone calls, this guy would tell her how much he loved her, and then he would state that he intended on killing her soon. One day, this phantom man even told Dorothy to go outside because he left a surprise on her car, and when she went outside to look, there was a single dead rose on her windshield, which is very creepy. On one of these particularly gruesome phone calls, the caller even stated that he planned on abducting Dorothy and chopping her up into little bits so that no one would ever find her. So these phone calls obviously terrified Dorothy, and in the week leading up to her disappearance, she started taking karate lessons. Okay, so let's flash back to the night that Dorothy disappeared. Remember, her friends were waiting for her outside of the hospital when they saw her car speed by them, but they couldn't see who was inside the vehicle. At around 4:30 a.m. that morning, 5 hours or so after they saw her car speeding away, the car was found abandoned in an alleyway 10 miles from the hospital, and it was on fire, which torched all evidence that could have been in the vehicle. So Dorothy would be missing for years, 4 years in fact. But it only took 1 week after her disappearance for the killer to start calling her own parents. So about every Wednesday afternoon for a period after Dorothy went missing, this caller would call her parents and say the strangest things. He would tell them things like, "I have her." He would also claim that he was the one who killed Dorothy. He was basically tormenting her parents and saying that he knows exactly where she is and what had happened, but he was never going to tell them. Now, 4 years later, this was going on for 4 years, in April of 1984, this caller once again called Dorothy's family, but instead of her mom picking up the phone that night, her dad did. And after her dad picked up the phone calls completely stopped. That is, until a few months later. Now, in August of 1984, a construction worker would come across a set of bones that belonged to a human and a dog. And those bones were eventually revealed to be those of Dorothy's. And immediately after her remains were found, the caller once again began to call her parents. This time, the police installed a recorder that bugged the family's phones. They were trying to get this guy's voice on recording and trace the phone calls, but the calls were never long enough for them to trace, and they still had no idea who this guy was. To this day, authorities still don't know how Dorothy died. And even though the phone calls eventually stopped, the killer's never been brought to justice. Now, the only suspect that's ever emerged in this case still doesn't have a name. It's the same guy that called, obviously, Dorothy's family, but it was a man who called a local newspaper just a few days after Dorothy went missing. And on this phone call, this guy said that he loved Dorothy, she had been cheating on him, and that he was the one who killed her. So that means that to this day, this killer is probably still out there somewhere, and they've never been brought to justice. This crime occurred over 40 years ago. There are no leads, and I don't think that this is a case that will ever be solved. If this killer dies, I'm sure that they're going to take this secret to the grave with them.
The murder of famous YouTuber and singer Christina Grimmie is one of the saddest and most shocking cases I've covered. It's the story of how one disturbed and obsessed individual took away everything she worked so hard to get. Hi, I'm Meg. I talk about true crime. Let's get into this case. This case hits very different for me because I really liked Christina Grimmie. It was really hard to go back and watch all those videos, so let's get into it. Christina Grimmie was born in New Jersey in 1994. She absolutely loved to sing from a very young age. In 2009, when she was only 15, she posted her very first cover onto YouTube.
Hi, I'm going to be singing I Don't Want to Be Torn by Hannah Montana,
under the username ZeldaxLove64. Little did she know that YouTube channel would absolutely change her life. Her first video that really went kind of viral was her cover of Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus. This was also in 2009, so her first year on YouTube. Christina was extremely talented, and the thing people really loved about her was how she added her own twist onto every cover that she did. She always managed to make her covers really unique. She slowly started getting more and more recognition, and in 2011 she started singing backup for Selena Gomez. She would even end up touring with Selena. June of 2011, she released an EP called Find Me, and it hit number 35 on the US Billboard 200. She was eventually on Ellen, her songs were being released on Radio Disney. Selena Gomez was her mentor. In 2012, she decided to move to LA to really focus on her career. At this point, her YouTube channel was growing super fast. She had grown to 2 million subscribers, 375 million views on her channel, and she was collaborating with a lot of other YouTubers and famous celebrities. The thing I really loved about Christina when I used to watch her was her energy. I always felt like you could tell she was a really kind person.
I just want to inspire people and be successful and make people happy, you know?
She really cared about everyone individually, which just makes everything in this case that much more heartbreaking. People loved Christina, and I think it was for the same reason that I did. She just seemed really genuine and caring. In 2014, she was on season 6 of The Voice. To this day, it's my favorite audition on any singing show ever. I'm not joking to you when I say I watched that audition a million times. I know it by heart. She performed Miley Cyrus's Wrecking Ball and blew everybody away, including me. All the judges obviously turned around for her. It was not an audition, it was more of an amazing performance. She ended up getting 3rd place on The Voice. I think she should have got 1st. I think she should have just won the moment she auditioned, to be honest. She was a star, and things just kept rising for her. She kept getting bigger and bigger. Throughout the years, she continued growing and releasing music. She released a lot of covers, and they were always just like chef's kiss amazing. Like, I won't lie to you, her version of Wrecking Ball on The Voice will forever, in my opinion, be better than Miley Cyrus's version. And I love Miley's voice and her songs, so that's saying a lot. Christina continued opening up and performing for bands and music groups. And that's exactly what she was going to do on the 10th of June, 2016. She was performing with Before You Exit at the Plaza Live in Orlando. Before the show, she posted an announcement just saying like, hey guys, I'm performing here tonight, come and support me. And she performed amazingly, as usual. The performance ended at 10 p.m. that night, and then Christina went to do a meet and greet. She was outside the venue just signing some autographs, greeting fans. Christina absolutely adored her fans, and it was so clear. Like, she was so thankful for every single one of them, and she always greeted everyone with open arms and kindness. Everything would take a horrible turn at around 10:24 during that meet and greet. Christina was approached by a 27-year-old man. His name was Kevin, and at first he seemed like a really shy fan, so Christina went to give him a hug. She greeted him with open arms, and that's when he pulled out a pistol and shot Christina 3 times. Kevin immediately started running off, and Christina's brother was actually there, and so he tackled Kevin to the ground. Kevin briefly got away, but he then took the gun and took his own life with the gun. Christina fell to the ground in front of her brother, her fans, and she was bleeding quite severely from the head. Christina was pronounced dead at 11 p.m. at the hospital that same night. She was shot once in the head and twice in the chest, and her entire promising future was taken away in a second. Let's talk a bit about Kevin now and why he did what he did. According to the police, that night, Kevin traveled with 2 guns, 2 magazines full of ammo, and a very large hunting knife. There were no metal detectors at the venue where the concert happened. Kevin didn't have any record of mental illness that they knew of, but he apparently had a very unrealistic and unhealthy obsession with Christina Grimmie. He was completely infatuated with her. He even tried to change his appearance to be more attractive for her. He lost weight, he got his teeth whitened, he got a hair transplant, and so much more. It was an extremely intense fixation and obsession. It's believed that Kevin killed Christina with the motive of, if I can't have you, nobody will. In his mind, he possessed her by taking her life. And apparently right before that night, he told people that he was tired and ready to ascend. Christina's death was a horrific tragedy. It was heartbreaking for everybody who knew her, her family, her fans, the entire YouTube community. If you were like me and watched a lot of YouTube in 2016, it was very different to how it is now. It was very close-knit, and the entire online community mourned her. It was truly devastating. Selena even paid tribute to Christina at one of her concerts. Here's that video.
One thing about Christina and her family is that she holds her faith so closely to her. And I don't really understand how this really happened, but I would like to dedicate this next song to her.
I find it really hard to watch that video and not cry. A lot of lawsuits and changes came after Christina's death. Venues were made to be a lot more strict when it came to security, as they should be. There should have never not been a metal detector at that venue. Christina Grimmie's family created the Christina Grimmie Foundation. Its purpose was to help victims who have suffered from gun violence. I feel like this story is pretty unknown, so I just wanted to share her legacy and voice because it should be heard by everyone. It's also very strange for me because when this happened, I was only 16, but now I'm 23. She was 22 when she died. It feels really strange. She was only 22 years old. She was so successful. She would have made it so far. And it was all taken away in a matter of minutes because someone was infatuated with her, obsessed to an unhealthy level. And that is the tragic case of Christina Grimmie. If you take anything away from this video, go check out her voice audition. It's unbelievable. It's horrible to think that if the security had just been better, she would literally be here right now. She would have made it so far. That's all for today. If you enjoy true crime videos, I've got a whole playlist down here with over 100 videos, so go crazy. I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.
This schoolboy stabbed his teacher to death in front of a classroom full of students. 61-year-old Anne Maguire was a Spanish teacher teaching in Leeds. She'd actually worked at the school for 40 years and she was only 5 months off retirement. However, in April 2014, something absolutely horrific happened. One of her students was 15-year-old Will Cornick. He'd always been described as a smart student who never really caused any trouble. Classmates regarded him as a polite student, but after he got diagnosed with diabetes, his personality seemed to change. In 2013, he tried to join the army, but because of his diagnosis, he was rejected. Being in the army had been his dream, so this was really upsetting for him. After failing to complete his Spanish homework, he was given detention by Anne. He also expressed a wish to her that he wanted to drop Spanish, but she wouldn't let him, which only angered him more. He began to develop a deep-rooted grudge against Anne. Shockingly, he reportedly messaged his friends on Facebook asking if one of them would kill her for him for £10. During one school day, halfway through his Spanish class, Will decided to get up and attack Anne with a knife. The classmates watched on in horror as he chased her out of the classroom. When there, another teacher heard her screams and tried to shield Anne from any more blows from him. Will then allegedly returned to his class and told his classmates how it was a shame that he hadn't killed her. However, Anne did actually pass away from her injuries. Will later admitted that he did plan also to kill 2 other teachers. One of them was actually pregnant at the time. He's been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years.
The story of this American female serial killer will make your hair stand up. As if her crimes are not horrific enough, she earned the nickname the Giggling Granny. How creepy is that? Nanny Doss was raised on a farm by a very controlling father, and one of the few joys that she had in life was sneaking into her mother's room and reading her romance novels, and she would daydream about the day that she'd be swept off her feet and have her happily ever after. And she got married to her first husband at the age of 16, and it was a miserable marriage. The couple had 4 daughters together, 2 of which mysteriously died of food poisoning, at which point the husband took one remaining daughter and fled because he was scared to death of Nanny. The remaining infant baby named Florine was left with Nanny, and Nanny picked up and married somebody new. Now this man was an alcoholic, but despite that, they were married 16 years and raised Florine together. This is where the bloodbath really begins. Nanny was in the room right after her daughter Melvina had given birth to her second grandchild, and while Melvina was still loopy from the labor drugs and she was exhausted, she could have sworn that she saw Nanny stick a hat pin in the baby's head. Melvina kind of passed out and went back to sleep, but when she came to, she started asking her family members, did Nanny have a hat pin and stick the baby in the head? And the family regretted to inform Melvina that the baby had in fact died, and yes, they did see Nanny holding a hat pin. However, the doctors couldn't give a positive explanation for the baby's death. The death of the baby absolutely shattered Melvina and her husband, and they started fighting and drifting apart, and Melvina started dating a soldier named Robert, who Nanny did not approve of. And one night when Melvina was out of the house and Robert was left alone with Nanny, Robert mysteriously died, and Nanny received $500 in life insurance that she had taken out on Robert a couple weeks earlier. Not long after that, Nanny's husband forced himself on her, and she didn't like that, so she put rat poison in his corn whiskey jar, and he died that night. Nanny married her third husband only 3 days after meeting him, and he died shortly after this of heart failure. She picked up some life insurance, bought some land, and built a new house. Her late third husband left behind a mother and a bedridden sister who also died shortly after. At this point, Nanny burned the house down, took that life insurance money, and moved on. Then Nanny landed a 4th husband, and at this point her mom moved in with him. She found out that her husband was cheating, so she poisoned him to death, and for good measure, she poisoned her mom to death too. Then she married her a 5th man named Samuel Doss, who was very disapproving of the romance novels that she loved to read. He went to the hospital one night with flu-like symptoms and was diagnosed with a severe digestive tract infection. He was treated and sent home. And a few days later, he showed up dead. The doctors were very suspicious of this, so they did an autopsy and found enough arsenic in his system to kill 20 men. Nanny was arrested shortly after this and confessed to killing 4 of her husbands, her mother-in-law, her mother, her sister-in-law, and yes, sadly, even the baby with the hat pin.
Cannibal facts that'll eat at you for days. If you thought Jeffrey Dahmer was picky for not eating people with tattoos, Venezuelan serial killer Dorangel Vargas, who ate 10 people, didn't like his victims to be overweight because he thought that they contained too much cholesterol. On Thanksgiving Day 1991, 23-year-old Omaima Nelson stabbed her sugar daddy William before carving him up and cooking his head in a deep fryer and eating him for dinner. In the 1970s, Jorge Negromonte Issei, also known as the Brazilian Sweeney Todd, would bake his victims into pies before selling them to local townsfolk. After murdering and eating his classmate in 1981, Issei Sagawa was released from prison because of a loophole in Japanese law.